We are going to get started here and keep sharing where you're from in the chat. Love to see a Nebraska in there. Welcome Tempe, welcome Goodyear, welcome Phoenix, Glendale. Love to see it. We're going to go ahead and get started. So like I said earlier, my name is Sarah. I work with ADDPC. We've collected a panel this morning of folks who are focused on special education, and in particularly supporting families across the state of Arizona who are figuring out what is coming down the pipeline in regards to our education landscape here. So we have three panelists here this morning, and I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll dive in. Just a note, we are going to handle questions at the end of the presentation. We know probably a lot of you do have questions, so feel free to add those in the chat as we move along. We've also collected some FAQs that we've been hearing that we will be addressing to the panelists. And so you may even hear one of your questions answered. And that is the format we're going with today. I'll start off with my boss, and that is Executive Director of ADDPC, John Myers. He has been a longtime advocate for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the lifespan here in Arizona. We're also welcoming our representative from the PNA, the Protection and Advocacy Agency, called Disability Rights Arizona. And Amanda Glass is joining us. She is a managing attorney there who leads the education team. Welcome, Amanda. And last but not least, we have Christopher Tiffany, another longtime advocate here in Arizona. He's a dad. He is a leader over at Encircle Families, formerly known as Raising Special Kids. And we are really grateful that everyone has joined us today. So John, I'm going to pass things over to you, and I will be moderating the chat. For those of you who are asking about a recording of today's presentation, you guessed it, we're recording, and we are going to send out the full presentation via email, even for those who registered but weren't able to join us live today. So feel free to share that with your network as we get that out over the next couple of days. Without further ado, John, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. Thank you to Amanda and Chris for being on our panel today. And thank you to all of you who are listening in, watching, whatever you may be doing. We appreciate your participation in the event, and we hope this is something that will be valuable to you today and, of course, well into the future. I am John Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, and I want to start off by emphasizing that whether we're talking about ADDPC, Disability Rights Arizona, or Encircle Families, we are nonpartisan organizations. So we are not on this call today to lobby for particular legislation or to make statements supporting or opposing particular candidates. Our job is to present circumstances as we see them, as objectively as possible. But at the same time, we, I hope, will speak candidly about our position on the circumstances that pertain to students with disabilities in Arizona right now, and perhaps even farther than the borders of Arizona. Our jobs are to advocate for and represent individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as many other disabilities in our state. And so it is important that we speak out on the issues as we see the ways they affect people with disabilities. So that being said, I just want to be clear that we are not taking partisan stances on issues today, but we are going to speak candidly about how we think they will affect students with disabilities across the state. So I'm going to start off with a question for both Amanda and Chris. And Amanda, I'll go to you first. If you can, briefly, give your sense of where, of the circumstances right now, where Arizona schools stand in terms of serving students with disabilities. How are they doing their job, and how potentially could they do better?
Great question. Thanks, John, and thanks to DDPC for having me. like Sarah said in the introduction, I'm an attorney at Disability Rights Arizona. I provide representation to students with disabilities when they're in disputes with their schools. So I often hear about the bad things that are happening. I'm not getting a lot of calls from parents or students who are thrilled with their schools. Um, that said, when we look at what's happened since early 2025, the last year and a half or so, um, there have definitely been changes. There's been a lot of stuff in the news. Um, but on the ground, what are the issues for kids in school? A lot of the issues are the same as they've always been. We have had struggles in Arizona with special education for a long time, particularly with identification of students with disabilities. So we are continuing to see that schools that are for whatever reason, whether they will say it's because they genuinely don't think the child has a disability, or if it's because of a funding issue, a staff capacity issue, simple logistics, are just failing to identify kids when they should be doing evaluations, collecting that data, having those meetings and determining, yes, the student is eligible under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for an IEP, Individualized Education Program. So identification of students in the first place remains a big barrier to them receiving appropriate services in Arizona schools. Um, we also continue to see a lot of problems with school discipline. Our kids with disabilities being disproportionately impacted by long-term suspension and expulsion, struggling to remain in school, which obviously becomes a barrier to getting the education that they need. Beyond that, we also hear, a lot of the same types of complaints we have for a long time about, am I getting the services that are in my IEP? Is my IEP appropriate in the first place? Continued concerns about things like, Arizona is a school choice state, but it doesn't always feel that way for our students with disabilities. It can be difficult for students with disabilities to feel like they're getting a fair shot when it comes to things like open enrollment and charter school enrollment. And although disability-based discrimination is not permitted by those entities, that's a complaint we hear a lot. I'm being denied enrollment on the basis of my disability. So all those things continue to be issues and have been issues for a long time. But I will say what I think has changed over the last year and a half are the enforcement mechanisms that are available for families who are facing these issues. Um, we used to have a fairly robust federal enforcement mechanism through the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm sure we'll dive more into this, but that office has largely been dismantled, and it really doesn't present a great enforcement option anymore. And that's becoming clear to families who are sitting and waiting to hear back from them after they've submitted a complaint. It's also well known by the schools and the school district council that OCR isn't really something to be concerned about as much anymore. And so to what degree that's impacted schools' adherence to their requirements, I don't want to speculate too much, but they're definitely aware. OCR is not out there watching them anymore the way they used to be. Um, and so you can imagine these schools that are really struggling with balancing staffing issues. We hear constantly about teacher shortages, resource issues, things like that. Without sort of that looming threat or watchdog component, there's likely been some impact on how schools are handling some issues that take up a lot of resources and time and personnel. Um, we also, and I'm sure again we'll talk more about this, but moving different things around at the federal government level, I think all of it, the uncertainty, the constant changes, I'm sure are causing anxiety not only for families but for schools as well, not really knowing where they're reporting to, who's watching them, what standards they're supposed to be meeting. And funding, always the funding question as well. So all of that is sort of the uncertainty, I think, has caused anxiety on all sides. In Arizona, I think the big thing that I'm going to try to come back to again and again during today's conversation is that IDEA and Section 504 still exist. There's still federal law that has not changed. There hasn't even been a move to eliminate those laws or change those laws right now. And that is really the most important thing for families and advocates to keep in mind. Kids are still entitled to a free and appropriate public education in school. What's challenging and scary is how is that being monitored and enforced? But you always, I don't want to say always, right now, we all continue to have the right to pursue our right to a free and appropriate public education through individual enforcement actions. So filing complaints with the state, that's still on the table, but families have the right to request what's called a due process hearing under IDEA. And that has not gone away. That has not changed in any state in the US. And, knocking on wood for everyone and our kids with disabilities, that won't go anywhere. What's really more up in the air is who else is watching it and what other enforcement options are there. But the right to ask for a hearing in front of an administrative law judge still stands. And truly, that has been the most effective mechanism for really fixing individual concerns when it comes to IDEA. So that's still there. You still have the right to an IEP. You still have the right to a free and appropriate public education. And if you're not getting it, you have the right to due process.
Okay. Thank you, Amanda. Chris, how would you weigh in on that?
Yeah, so first, thank you, Amanda. I would actually agree with every single thing you said. And I come to this work with a little bit of a different lens. The Disability Rights Arizona is our protection and advocacy organization, and Circle of Families is Arizona's parent training and information center. So that's why you actually see both organizations on the procedural safeguards at the IEP meeting, because both of us kind of get federal dollars to do a little bit different things. And one of our mandates is really to help families resolve disputes at the lowest possible level. So whereas, absolutely families have a right to due process and complaint, they also have a right to mediation, which is kind of a less formal, less adversarial, but still formal dispute resolution option that is guaranteed to them in the federal law. So coming to this from that perspective, I'll just share a little bit of top 5 data, top 5 things that we hear from families in regard to special education. And number 1, we talk to families about IEPs, individualized education programs, either their implementation, how to understand what's in their child's IEP, anything having to do with the IEP. Eligibility and evaluation is typically number 2. Discipline is either 3 or 4, that waffles with placement. And then number 5 is going to be, I think, it depends on the time of year. Sometimes it's school choice or ESA, and that's usually right at the end of a school year, right at the beginning of a school year, or it is, I think, behavior. So families do come to us with a lot of questions, and like Amanda mentioned, they usually don't call us when they're happy. It's because they have an issue or they don't understand something, they need clarity, they need to just talk to somebody and let them know what's going on and try to get help. John, to your question, what can schools be doing better? From our lens, what schools could be doing a lot better is communicating with families. I think 70 to 90% of the calls that we get, the school is maybe not, definitely constrained. All of the financial constraints, all of the budget constraints, all of the OCR being dismantled, all of that is absolutely true. However, disputes probably could have been resolved with an extra effort by the teacher to send an additional email or pick up the phone and call, or for some other going the extra mile with communicating with the family. So I know that's a little bit different of a lens, but I thought I would take it. And if you want to know what one thing schools could be doing differently, it's being better communicators with families.
Okay. Thank you for that perspective. Thank you both for that perspective. Let's get into some of the things that are probably most on the minds of families, students, educators, so forth right now. There's been a lot of talk about changes to education at the federal level. And we know that the Trump administration has long said it would like to do away with the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education. That requires an act of Congress to effectuate, and that has not taken place yet. But in the interim, many proposals have been put forward, and even agreements have been signed between the Department of Education and the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, and the Department of Health and Human Services to transfer programs out of the direct oversight of the Department of Education and into the oversight areas for those different departments. We know, for example, that the Office of Civil Rights is intended to be moved to the Department of Justice. Some employment programs are intended to be moved to the Department of Labor, Employment and Voc Rehab, and the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services is intended to be moved to Health and Human Services. If all of those things were to come to pass, and of course there is some resistance to that, both in Congress and in the courts right now, if all of those things, however, were to come to pass, what would be the impact on students, and let's say students in Arizona, since that's where we do our work, what would be the near-term and far-term impacts on the students with disabilities who go to school here in Arizona? And I'll allow either one of you to dive in on that one first.
I'll take a stab. It's hard to say, this is unprecedented. We don't know. What I will say is that with the Office for Civil Rights, I'll start with that, and then OSERS as sort of the two big offices within Ed that we're looking at being moved. The Office for Civil Rights is within the Department of Education. It has the statutory authority to investigate complaints that Section 504 and the ADA, which are both federal disability rights laws, whether they've been violated by a recipient of public funding. So that's public school districts and charter schools, as well as post-secondary institutions, community colleges, universities that receive public funding. OCR also enforces a number of other federal civil rights laws, including Title IX, Title VII. I think moving it to DOJ would be interesting. DOJ and OCR already have a working relationship in that if OCR conducts an investigation, finds noncompliance, and is unable to achieve voluntary resolution, meaning first OCR goes to the school and says, hey, we investigated, we think you're discriminating against a student with a disability in these ways. Here are the steps we've identified that we'd like you to take to fix it. Policy change, training for staff, giving the students some compensatory education, whatever it might be. Typically, I would say in the vast majority of cases, the schools or the recipient of the federal funding is willing to agree to that voluntary resolution, and that's the end of it. And it's much more, yes, OCR is a watchdog, but it's not litigation. It's really like, hey, we looked into this, we think this is a problem, let's come to an agreement to fix it. And the schools almost always are on board and say, okay, fine, we'll fix it. OCR and Department of Ed then have, if necessary, there's a lot of interim steps of like following up and trying again and timelines, but they could withhold federal funding from that recipient. That's one of the steps they could take. They can also refer the case to Department of Justice for litigation. DOJ is really designed as the litigation branch, of the government. And so it's not about informal resolution. It's about filing a lawsuit, going to court, and litigating. And families right now, very few do this, but families have the right to file a complaint directly with DOJ instead of going to OCR. The difference is that DOJ has discretion to decide which cases they're going to take and file lawsuits on and which ones they're going to just ignore. OCR statutorily is required to investigate every single complaint that comes to them that's within their jurisdiction. The problem right now is that they're so understaffed and their attention is in so many different directions that wait time is very extensive. but they are supposed to look at all those complaints, whereas DOJ is not. So there's already some cooperation between OCR and DOJ, but DOJ is much more about litigation, whereas OCR historically, when it's been under Department of Ed, has had more of this flexibility to work with schools to bring them into compliance. They also provide technical assistance to schools. It's more of that informal resolution spirit that Chris was talking about, whereas DOJ is very much like, you're in trouble, you're getting sued by the federal government. So it's an interesting move in that way. It's also, again, kind of separating out special ed, components of special ed from the rest of public education, which I think, the spirit of it feels problematic to a lot in the disability community, because it looks like you're taking special education, which is supposed to be part of a broader public education administration, and you're moving parts of it around. I think that's also a big part of the concern with moving OSERS to HHS. You're taking something that was education first, and making it, sort of medicalizing it. And we've got that regression, that feeling of regression, like we are taking people with disabilities, and instead of saying you are part of the community, you're part of the populace, this is education broadly, you're a gen ed student first. We're saying, actually, no, you belong with Health and Human Services, which is more medically focused. So I think that's very troubling for a lot in the disability community to see, in terms of the spirit of it. The direct impact, again, it's really hard to say. Apart from decentralizing things, proponents of dismantling Department of Ed will say this is going to eliminate red tape and make things better. I think a lot on the other side are concerned it's going to make things a lot more complex logistically, because instead of having everything centralized in one Department of Ed, now you've got 3 different departments all trying to work with the same population. They're not able to communicate with each other. They're not able to get the technical assistance and guidance out. I mean, something we've seen historically is OSERS and OCR putting out joint guidance and recommendations. That will be harder to accomplish with them in separate departments. So I think in some ways there are concerns about how effective the offices are going to be at all when they're separated out like this. So the logistics are tough, and it does weaken the coordination that was there previously. But in terms of on the ground, like, again, I'll come back to, it's hard to know for sure, but you continue to have rights under 504, you continue to have rights under IDEA. This is more about the oversight and support that the schools will be getting from the federal government. Will they choose to comply with the law just based on individuals taking action? Will they choose to comply because they want to be compliant and they agree with the spirit of the law? I mean, without the federal purse strings really being dangled, or the possibility of litigation from DOJ, it's harder to know how compliant schools will be on the ground.
So Chris, if I could interject really quickly, there are some in the disability community who feel actually that although they wouldn't advocate for a move of these programs out of the Department of Education, they feel that if the move is going to take place, or the moves are going to take place, and OSERS is going to move to HHS, at least the leadership within the Administration on Disabilities at HHS comes from a special education background, and therefore there might actually be some advantages in that move. Chris, how would you respond to that argument?
I guess if, thanks, John, for that. I think one of the concerns that we have is so that's good if Department of Ed ends up at HHS and there is some leadership with experience, that's great. And I would hope that the brain trust that is currently in OSEP would also go over to HHS, to preserve that institutional knowledge to the extent possible. I think Amanda, you hit on a lot of really important themes. For me, I step back at it and I look at it, and for 50 years, IDEA has really been about, inclusion of individuals with disabilities in their communities and their schools, alongside non-disabled peers. And what this move, which is really being kind of um, reported as streamlining efficiencies, better grants management, better alignment between agencies. That all might really be true, but from a family perspective and from a parent perspective, what I really want to know is, how is this move going to improve outcomes for my child? And we haven't gotten an answer to that, other than it's going to streamline the grants management process and the efficiencies and cutting the red tape. So again, the bigger, I think, challenge for me, and I think many in the disability community, is the kind of the philosophy behind the move, right? We are taking an education system and we're moving all of it over here, but we're going to take this piece and we're going to move it over here. And I think one of our greatest fears is that we start moving back towards institutionalization of people with disabilities. And so bigger than just the education system, but our home and community-based services system, our Medicaid systems, and maybe we'll talk more about that in this conversation. But as far as specifically the move from OSERS to HHS and the separation of OCR from OSERS or from the Department of Ed, that too is a concern. You had a special education and its enforcement agency living under one roof, and we're separating those apart now, and for efficiency purposes. But it's not clear how that would make things easier for families. So again, I would agree with Amanda. It is still a lot of this is still very unclear. They have been clear about IDEA is not going away, 504 is not going away. So we know that students and families still have rights under both of those federal laws. And so, what I think initially, if it were to change tomorrow, I don't think we would see a huge change at the school level, really anytime soon. But again, the longer term implications are what we're concerned about.
Well, and very briefly, since you touched on home and community-based services, we probably are all aware of the Department of Justice's recent opinion related to Olmsted. Is it, for either one of you, is it your feeling that guidance from DOJ could in any way affect the educational services that students with disabilities receive?
Amanda, can I go first and then you can? Okay. Just because I'm already on topic, I don't want to lose my train of thought. First, Amanda will have a much better legal answer to this question. What I will do is take it back to philosophy. What essentially I'm hearing or how I'm perceiving that coming out of the Department of Justice is that, we're starting to rethink our philosophy on whether or not it's okay to have people with disabilities in institutions. And, the fact that that's even a question and that we're talking about it, to me is very challenging as a leader in this community. So philosophically, I can't speak to its legality, but philosophically, to me, it appears like a step in the wrong direction. Go ahead, Amanda.
Agreed. The protection and advocacy system, of which DRAZ is a part, was really founded on the principles that underlie Olmsted, that people with disabilities should have the right to an integrated life with independence and to be free from abuse and neglect. I mean, we came out of the time when rampant abuse and neglect was happening in institutions like Willowbrook. That's why Congress created the PNA system. And so it's extremely disheartening to see the federal government signal that, they no longer really support that underlying message about integration. In terms of the impact in schools, the good news, I guess, is that IDEA is its own law, and IDEA has least restrictive environment built into it. So that is a concept that stands independent from Olmstead case law. It stands independent even from the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's its own law, and it references that students should be educated in the least restrictive environment alongside their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. We have always had individual fights about what is the LRE for a specific child. And we do often see what we might consider too much segregation of our kids, seeing them being put into segregated classroom settings, segregated school sites, even residential treatment centers. But we always have that legal hook, and you can go to due process and argue about whether for this particular child they are being educated currently in the least restrictive environment or not. And again, I will say, everything that's happening federally, to Chris's point, feels like signals about where Congress and the administration want things to go, and these things could be changed through an act of Congress. But right now, today, IDEA is the law. IDEA includes least restrictive environment. And so for at least for kids in schools, we still have that. And there hasn't been an opinion or guidance from Department of Ed as of now reinterpreting what LRE means. That's still in law. It's still understood, I think, the same way it has been for now. We'll see what comes in the future. To Chris's point, all of this sort of signals additional moves in that direction. But right now, I don't think that particular Olmstead opinion should have a major impact on our student population. I guess one way we could see it become more problematic is if we have a rise in the number of residential treatment facilities or other institutions where kids are placed for medical reasons in the first place, and then figuring out how they're going to be educated while they're being institutionalized for medical reasons. Are they going to be able to leave the institution to go to a neighborhood school? Are they going to have an on-site school? Are they going to receive education at all? Which is something that we've dealt with a lot. Getting calls from families saying my kid has been hospitalized because of mental health reasons and they're not getting any education while they're there. Can you help us? So I don't know that our state or any state is really prepared for a massive influx of young people into institutions in terms of anything, but especially in terms of education. How would we develop an education system that reaches them if they are institutionalized? But at this moment, LRE exists independent of the Olmstead decision.
Okay. I'm going to touch on what feels like the third rail of Arizona policy, education policy right now, or at least one of the third rails, and that is empowerment scholarship accounts. There is an initiative on the ballot this November related to placing additional controls or guardrails around how ESAs are provided, who is eligible to utilize them, what reporting has to be done, and so forth. And I think, again, we probably all know the history of ESAs in Arizona. They were initially started as a program to support students with disabilities, and in recent years, the eligibility standards have expanded, and now it's basically a universal program for almost any student or family that wants to take advantage of them. Perhaps you could give your perspective on the initiative itself, and if it passes or if it doesn't pass, what impact will that have, if any, on students with disabilities around the state?
Chris, do you want to go first? You're on mute.
I was going to allow you the opportunity to do that. I'll weigh in. My understanding, and again, everything I say is my understanding and my perspective. Is my understanding is that the current bill would not have a huge effect on students that are eligible for the ESA program as students with disabilities. I believe there's some uh, financial limitations for students in the universal pool. But for our population, we wouldn't expect to see a lot of families coming to Encircle Families saying, hey, I'm going to get kicked out of the ESA program. Amanda, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but I'm going to reserve the right to follow up.
For sure. Yeah, I will give the same disclaimer John gave. Disability Rights Arizona does not have a position pro or against, for or against ESA as a concept. I will say broadly that we hear really great things from some of our clients about their experience using ESA, and we also hear some bad things. So we know that even the disability community itself is not a monolith when it comes to ESA. There are a lot of competing voices and opinions out there. The initiative, again, my understanding based on what I've read, but I'm certainly not an expert in ballot initiatives or writing that type of language. But my understanding is that, yes, there are some limitations that are built into it. Chris mentioned the income cap. My understanding is that that is not, the income cap limitation does not apply to students with disabilities. So there are sort of two groups. There's the universal voucher group, and then there's the disability voucher group. A lot of the limitations in the bill or in the ballot initiative are specific to the universal, not the disability. So that said, I think you might hear some people who would say, well, it would be good for kids with disabilities if there was a sort of a curbing of the universal ESAs, because maybe that would put more money back in a pot that could benefit the students with disabilities. I don't know that that is true or not. I think we know that's a very costly program overall, and so I don't know how much this limitation will benefit kids with disabilities. Right now, kids with disabilities should be getting the amount that they are eligible for. And I don't know that anyone with disabilities has been told, oh, you're getting less because the program has expanded so much. I mean, the amount you get is really based on the baseline that goes out to all kids plus the weighted amount that's related to your eligibility category. I will say, with all the politicization and discussion about potential fraud and things like that, my office, and again, now I'm just speaking about what we see here, we've started getting more calls from families who are on ESA, and typically the calls we get are for families who have students with disabilities. We're on ESA and we've been using it successfully for years, and suddenly we got audited and now we're facing a suspension of our ESA account, or they're trying to claw back funding. And I think that has come out of, a lot of news stories about all this fraud. And so there's been a bit of a crackdown on how things are administered. And that could change. We have an election coming up in November. I don't know how that will impact how ESA is administered by the Department of Ed, but it definitely appears, again, just based on the complaints and calls that our office has received, that there's been a bit of an uptick in oversight. And some of that, I'm sure, is very valid, like we're suspending your account because you spent a ton of money on lingerie or whatever. But we are hearing from families who are saying, well, the stuff we spent money on was a permitted expense. That was our understanding. Maybe things have changed and what is and isn't permitted, but we were using it to buy school supplies or things we thought were permitted expenses, and now they're telling us it's not. So that has increased in our office, or that's what we've heard in our office. And whether the ballot initiative will have an impact on the auditing for approved expenses or not, I couldn't say. But I do think overall, my impression overall is that the ballot initiative should not have a major impact on students who are using the disability ESA. It's more about curbing the use of the universal ESA voucher program. I will also throw out, before I let Chris jump in again, that there are things that I don't think the ballot initiative does that I wish something would do with regard to ESA and disability, which is that I think a lot of families don't realize that when they take ESA money, and whether they're using it to homeschool, private school, um, they think, well, this is taxpayer dollars. So the way and I'm being audited, right? People are watching how I spend it. There must be some protections for my kid if I'm paying a provider with this money. That provider should be subject to some type of oversight. And in fact, they're not. You lose a lot of your rights under IDEA when you take ESA money. So we'll have families call us and say, hey, I used ESA. I put my kid in this private school that's meant to serve students with disabilities, and now they're being suspended or expelled, or they were restrained and secluded, or they're not getting a service I thought they were going to get. I want to file a complaint. What are my rights? And the answer, unfortunately, is you don't have many. You don't have the right to go to the Arizona Department of Ed and file a state complaint. You don't have the right to a due process hearing because you have waived your rights under IDEA by electing to private school your student. There are a few rights you retain, but a lot of the dispute resolution and discipline related rights go out the door. And this ballot initiative does not address that. It doesn't require families to sign any type of acknowledgement that they're waiving those rights when they take ESA. It doesn't require entities that accept ESA funding to subject themselves to any kind of oversight or dispute resolution. So that is not in the ballot initiative that's going to be on the ballot.
Yeah, thank you. Amanda, you actually touched on a point I was going to touch on. When families, and that is a very common call that we get from families about the voucher program, ESA, the voucher program. What is it all about? How do I get into it? As the Parent Training and Information Center, we provide information training support on all of Arizona's options. But we do try to make it clear that, when you go into the ESA program, you're opting out of your protections under IDEA. And I've heard it explained like this, what do you do when your hamburger is served cold to you at a restaurant? Well, you talk to the server, and then you talk to the manager, and then you talk to the owner, right? I mean, it's very much, when we're in a private school situation, we don't have the rights and protections under IDEA. How do we appropriately communicate our concerns to the teacher, the administrator, the owner of that private institution to try to get resolve, because there is not a lot of real recourse under the laws. So that was the only thing I wanted to add.
Okay, we want to reserve some time for questions if possible, but I also want to touch on one other issue, and that's related to applied behavioral analysis, or ABA therapy. There are some new rules going into effect. We know that Access and DDD are implementing some new rules around ABA starting this fall, I believe October 1st, possibly November 1st. And then there are some changes to home and community-based services, a new eligibility tool and appeals process for that that'll go into effect, we think, on December 1st. But regarding ABA, for students who are receiving a certain number of hours of ABA therapy right now, and there's a possibility, some would say likelihood, that there are going to be a lot of reductions in the eligibility for students receiving ABA once the new tool goes into effect. Is there, from your perspective, I'm not exactly sure how to ask the question, but how will those students, or how will their families then accommodate a reduction in hours? What recommendations would you make? Or will they have to go back to school districts and spend more time in a public or a private school? How will they adjust, or how could they adjust to fewer hours being made available to them and the need to then continue the education process throughout the day? I hope that makes sense.
Happy to take a stab at it, Amanda. John, that's a huge question, especially with the kind of the amount of school options that families have. And my understanding is that, and again, I don't know exactly, I don't think that date has been set for implementation. I think They're still working on those things, but October 1st, November 1st, December 1st, those would all make sense. Um, if I'm a family and I have a child that's receiving 35, let's say 35 hours of ABA therapy a week, and my hours were to um, get reduced by 10 hours a week or 15 hours a week. Your question, I'm understanding as what are families' options? How can they kind of replace that? Is that kind of what I'm hearing? So, I think it depends on maybe on their school options a little bit. If they're in public education, that is not going to automatically trigger their school team to do anything different because the school is required to provide free and appropriate public education under an IEP. So whatever services they're getting at school probably wouldn't be impacted by a change in their home and community-based services outside of school. Um, so what can families do? I think, if they are long-term care eligible, what other home and community-based services are they eligible for to supplement that? Perhaps additional habilitation hours, or I know that respite can't really be used for therapy, but just thinking about how families adapt to service cuts. Yes, but to take it back to education, um, they could look if their child was in a private school under an ESA, they might be some options for an after-school DTA program if the school is doing that. There are options, but they're going to all be very, very individualized to that family and what their current setup is for education. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, caveat that this is not my area of expertise. We have a healthcare team that has been deeply involved in the all the various changes coming down from Medicaid to access to DDD. Um, that said, I would kind of echo what Chris said. I think what I've seen in the cases I've worked on historically is we have a student, let's say with autism, who qualifies for a huge amount of ABA therapy, 40, 50 hours a week, and it's hard to go to school and get all of those hours. And so I've seen families ask schools, can my kid be on a half-day schedule so that they can get ABA the rest of the day at a center or at home? And so this will be an opportunity to go on the full day schedule. I mean, the schools, like Chris said, the schools have an obligation to provide students a free and appropriate public education. Issue that we deal with a lot are schools putting kids on shortened school days because of their behavior. Regardless of whether they're getting services outside school or not, it's more about, we think this is what's best for your child. They can't handle a full day. We're going to put them on a half day or 2 hours a day, with really no explanation of how the family's supposed to fill the rest of that day. So that's problematic and something we fought back against and said, this isn't FAPE. This isn't fair. It's not equal to what their non-disabled peers are getting. If everyone else is in school for 30 hours a week and this kid's in school 10 hours a week, that's clear discrimination on the basis of disability related behavior. So I think advocating for full school days is going to be a big part of it. And schools are also obligated to address behavioral concerns. So they don't have a direct obligation to provide ABA therapy, but they do have an obligation to meet behavioral needs, whether they call it ABA or something else. Behavior support is often a service listed in a student's IEP, and it's something that, it's possible you may want to ask for an IEP meeting to talk about, hey, this is a big change that's coming for my kid. I think they're going to potentially need more behavior support services at school. Let's talk about that as a team now. I would recommend inviting your DDD support coordinator to the IEP meeting. If you're working with a particular vendor for the ABA, invite that person, the RBT or the BCBA, to come to your IEP meeting and share. I mean, that's something, going back to Chris's earlier point about communication, we always encourage families to try to include all of the providers, the wraparound services they're getting, bring those people to the IEP meeting so the school can be part of that broader team and people can share the goals that they're working on with DDD, can be, can inform the goals that go into the IEP and things like that. So I do think, again, schools and the ongoing obligation to provide FAPE is still there, regardless of what's happening with the outside services. And I think what's happening at school may need to be informed by the changes happening outside of school. So bring that up to your IEP team. Ask if this is something that requires a change in duration, frequency of services, a change in goals in the IEP to make sure that your students' behavior at school is not an impediment to their access to education while they're there.
Okay. So given the circumstances we live in today, given the proposed changes to take place, the changes that we know are going to take place but may take some time to roll out, all of those circumstances, love to hear from each of you. What actions can or should families take at this point to ensure that their students continue to receive the education they're entitled to, continue to get the attention they deserve, continue to be protected from adverse actions? What in this current environment can and should families be doing for the well-being of their students?
I'm happy to jump on that, Amanda.
Go ahead.
First, I'm going to say, don't panic. Don't panic, but pay attention. A lot of changes are coming. We've been hearing about changes for the last year and a half, but don't panic and pay attention. A proposal is not the same thing as a law being changed. So the proposal from OSERS to move to HHS, that is likely not going to have an immediate ground level impact on your child's education, especially if they're in a public school or an ESA school. But know what your child's current services are, what they look like, know what your rights are. Keep good records, ask good questions, participate in your child's IEP and treatment planning. I think all of the things, John, that I would recommend that families do are things that we recommend families do all the time. Just in a time of heightened stress and heightened change, I think it's just really important to pay attention and know what's going to happen so that you can adjust when it does.
I'd echo that, of course. I think staying on top of what your kiddo is entitled to, or you, if you're a self-advocate, what you're entitled to in terms of DDD services, what's in your ISP, what changes might be proposed. Keep in touch with your support coordinator. Same with your IEP team. If you have concerns like going into a new school year, this is a good time to ask for an IEP meeting. From the time a parent or adult student requests an IEP review meeting, the school must hold that meeting under state law within 45 school days. So if you ask for it now, you should have that meeting before fall break. That should take place. And it's a good opportunity to come together, look at the IEP, review it, update it. It doesn't matter if your annual IEP date is coming due. Take this opportunity to look at things and update the team about things that are maybe happening outside of the school environment. There were some questions I saw in the chat, and I think this goes with what you asked, John, about what are our options in terms of enforcement in light of what's happening federally. So for IDEA, you still have this pretty much the same rights you had. A lot of that was enforced by the state. So the Arizona Department of Ed still exists. They still have general supervisory authority to ensure IDEA is being followed by the schools throughout the state, public charter and public district. So you have the right to file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Education if you think there's been a procedural violation of IDEA. You have the right, like Chris said, you can ask for free mediation services from Department of Ed, a facilitated IEP meeting from Department of Ed. If you are unable to resolve your issue, you have the right to ask for that due process hearing in front of an administrative law judge. All of that's in your procedural safeguards notice that the school should be giving you. So I always recommend families take a look at that. If it's way too complex to understand, there's the Navigating the Special Education Highway that Encircle Families has on their website. So more of a parent-friendly version of that. We have some explainer videos on our website, Disability Rights AZ, animated videos explaining those procedural safeguards. So really try to know your rights, like Chris said, so you know what tools you do have in your tool belt. The question specifically about discrimination, bullying, harassment, that's not really something, unfortunately, that ADE will look at, and it's not something you can go to due process over. That really was within the wheelhouse of the Office for Civil Rights. So, in light of the major changes there, my organization did a series of blog posts over the summer about sort of what are your alternatives without OCR, where can you go? High level summary is that you can potentially take advantage of the Arizonans with Disabilities Act for very specific types of discrimination, and that would be a complaint that would go to the Arizona Attorney General's office. So that's still on the table. Of course, trying to directly resolve your issue with the school. There is the option for a hearing under Section 504. Every recipient of public funds is supposed to have its own hearing procedure for discrimination under 504. So you could try to utilize that. It's not very well utilized, but school districts should actually offer an impartial hearing to deal with discrimination issues. And then at the end of the day, you do have the opportunity or the option to file a lawsuit. And you can go, if it's a pure discrimination complaint, you should be able to go straight to federal court under 504, the ADA. So what I would like to do is I can throw in the chat a link to our blog post series that kind of goes over those alternative enforcement options. But really, the best thing, to Chris's point, is to know what's going on, to be in communication with your child's school. And when there is a concern, try to address it quickly and don't let it fester. Ask for that IEP meeting, ask for a facilitated IEP meeting if tensions are high, and try to resolve it without needing to go this route.
And just one more thing to add. One thing that I think everybody should do, that they should always do, is vote. We do have, as individuals in this democracy, the power to change things with our vote. So I would encourage everyone to go out and vote this election cycle.
Thank you very much. Any final thoughts either of you would like to add, or shall we just open it up for questions?
I'm ready for questions.
I'm not sure how long I can stick around for questions. I'm here till 12:30, but I will stick around as long as I can.
Okay. So Sarah, do we have questions to pose to our
We
panel?
do, and Amanda just answered one of them from the chat, so that was helpful, but I'll just read it out loud. Paul was asking, when requesting an IEP meeting, does the 45-day rule apply for private school paid for by ESA funds? And you responded that does not apply because when you take ESA to private school, there are almost no IDEA rights. I know you also answered the question about harassment and bullying at school and what families can do to protect disabled students, especially with the changes at OCR. Thank you for including that blog post link. I was about to do it and you beat me to it. Everyone is encouraged to click on that. There are 6 parts to that blog series I just discovered, so you can look at the sidebar for the additional parts, but it looks very, very helpful. We also have several questions from earlier. Sue was asking about, the ability of outside people, like an RBT certified individual, accompanying students to public school. Is that going to be an option?
So it depends on the school. Most schools, in my experience, are hesitant to have any outside provider come onto campus for liability reasons. They will say we can take, we can address the students' behavioral needs ourselves with our own staff. We don't need outside assistance. But it does depend. I mean, sometimes smaller schools, charters, rural schools that really can't handle it are willing to say, sure, we'll take the free help. But if that question is directed to like, does that count towards my ABA hours? That I'm not sure of. I would think it would. And so if your hours have been reduced, it's possible it will impact the ability of an RBT to provide services during the school day.
You might also have some challenges if that RBT is paid for by Medicaid, taking them into a school setting. You might have challenges there too.
It'll be interesting to see if policy modifies these kind of long-standing ways the districts are handling this in the next couple of years. Florence, we'll move to a different question. Florence was asking, are there any concrete actions we can take to bring our concerns both to the state and federal government beyond contacting our representatives and voicing our concerns? Are there individuals who are already advocating in this space whom we could support?
Well, I'll do a little pitch. I hope Carla doesn't mind. I think she's on the call. So there's a group, a relatively newly formed group called Arizona Champions for Kids, that is really focused on championing students with disabilities and special ed, aiming for higher outcomes for our kids with disabilities. This group is open. I'm going to put the link in the chat to parents, advocates to join. Even if you just join to get on the listserv to get updates about what the group is working on. I think it's a really good group, and they/we, I'm part of the group, are working on various aspects, you know, direct individual advocacy, resource creation for self-advocacy, lobbying and legislative types of changes, broader policy changes. So that's one group I would say to keep an eye out on, that's really looking at these issues and trying to make state level change. It's an Arizona specific group.
Yeah, and John, I don't know if you want to make a plug for DAPA, the Disability Advocacy Policy Alliance. Did I get that right?
You got it right.
Yes, and I don't know, Sarah, if you can put that in the chat, but that's a group of Arizona organizations that convene weekly to discuss and distribute information on policy and advocacy issues as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right. Sarah, any other questions?
Doesn't look like we have any other questions, just some thank yous in the chat. We also have shared a survey link. Thank you, Jason, for posting that. That's if you want to give us any feedback on this topic. Feel free to give us other ideas for follow-up presentations. We are planning another education focused webinar, same format. This will be in particular talking about transition. And so we're talking about older students who have an eye out for post-secondary options. We'll talk about dual enrollment. We'll talk about our Think College efforts. We'll talk about asking for accommodations and really training students ahead of time to start to self-advocate, you know, bringing them to those IEP meetings, learning the language so that once they get into a post-secondary program, if that's their choice, they are comfortable going to the disability resource centers. I know someone earlier in the chat, I think it was Cassie, mentioned that she's getting accommodations from MCC. So we know that we're getting a lot of calls about this right now because, again, back to school time, college is about to start. So we don't have a date yet for this webinar, but it's going to be soon. And we hope to just keep everybody up to date on that. We also, quick plug, will be at the IDEA conference next week. For those of you who want to stop by our table, we'll have a lot of resources regarding transition and the important topics for older students. And if you have any follow-up questions from today, we're happy to chat as well. I'll put the DAPA link in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Any last words from our speakers, our panel?
Just thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much. We appreciate you guys organizing and, you know, yeah, inviting us and providing the information to the public. So thank you for all your efforts.
Well, and thank you to Disability Rights Arizona and Encircle Families for all the work you do to support students with disabilities, their families, their caregivers. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate those who stuck around to the very end, and we will make sure that the recording is available to anybody who wants to look again. Please don't hesitate to follow up with us if we can answer other questions or if we can go into more detail about any of these issues. We are always happy to do so. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend.